The traditional architecture of a geopolitical crisis usually has this recognizable rhythm to it.
Right, like a slow buildup.
Exactly. You get the slow ratcheting up of tensions. You see those back-channel diplomatic cables that inevitably leak to the press.
Oh yeah, the highly visible movement of carrier strike groups, televised ultimatums, all of that.
Right. It operates on a timeline of months or sometimes even years. You can literally see the storm systems forming on the horizon, which, gives everyone involved time to calculate their next move.
Or at least pretend to calculate it.
Yeah, fair point. But when you look at the telemetry data, the casualty reports, and the strike logs from February 28, 2026, you realize immediately that the old rhythm is just dead.
Completely dead.
There was no horizon. There was no escalation ladder. We're looking at a day where the entire security paradigm of the Middle East simply detonated. Just everywhere, all at once. So welcome to this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
Today, we are attempting to map out a truly unprecedented multi-front regional war that exploded with a suddenness that honestly caught the entire globe completely off guard.
It really is a singularity event. The sheer velocity and scale of what commenced on February 28, it defies almost all contemporary military modeling for this region.
Yeah, it's not normal.
Not at all. We aren't looking at a border skirmish or a proportional retaliatory strike. We are analyzing a sudden, massive, and highly coordinated attempt to violently rewire the balance of power across over a dozen nations simultaneously.
And to give you, the listener, a clear view of how something this catastrophic actually functions on a mechanical level, we aren't just reading the headlines today.
No, we really had to dig deep for this one.
We did. We've pulled war room data, intercepted strike logs, raw economic analyses from think tanks spanning from Cambridge to Beijing.
It's a massive stack of paper.
Huge. We have tactical data from ACL Aid, on-the-ground crisis assessments from the International Crisis Group, health infrastructure reports from the World Health Organization, and strategic policy breakdowns from Chatham House and the Council on Foreign Relations.
Which is crucial because you need all those angles.
Exactly. We are layering all of this together to figure out how a joint U.S. Israeli operation fundamentally broke the Middle East, and how those shockwaves are tearing through everything from global shipping insurance to the internal politics of Lebanon.
But before we get into the blast radius here, we should probably start a quick but really essential ground rule.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
So the documents and intelligence assessments we're looking at today are authored by the very entities fighting this war.
Right.
From the Pentagon to the highest levels of government in Tehran to the policy architects in Beijing and Tel Aviv. These are highly charged, fiercely contested narratives.
Extremely polarized.
Yeah, so we aren't here to tell you who the quote-unquote good guys are. And we are certainly not endorsing any of the shifting political justifications for these strikes.
Our sole objective is to open up their playbooks, impartially report the data, and show you exactly what they're doing and why they're doing it. We're maintaining strict neutrality throughout this deep dive.
Just looking at the machinery of the conflict.
Exactly.
Yeah. Just
the machinery. And to understand the machinery, you have to look at the spark, the initial operations on February 28.
Right. Dubbed Epic Fury by the United States and Roaring Lion by Israel.
When you read the ACLE tactical breakdown of those first 24 hours, the primary objective wasn't deterrence. It was the immediate, overwhelming decapitation of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
And according to the crisis group timeline, they actually achieved their primary objective almost instantly.
Yeah, an Israeli munition bypassed the defense grid and hit a building in Tehran, killing the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
Which, from a doctrinal standpoint, a decapitation strike of that magnitude is incredibly rare.
Because you can't predict what happens next, right?
Exactly. The second-order effects are almost impossible to calculate. Khamenei wasn't just a military commander. He was the ideological, spiritual, and political linchpin of an entire state apparatus.
Right, the whole system revolved around him.
Yeah, and the regime had, of course, spent years theorizing about succession, but succession plans are designed for a hospital bed. They aren't designed for a command and control center collapsing under the weight of bunker-buster munitions.
Wow, and the strike package didn't just stop with the supreme leader either.
No, not at all. The data shows that up to 40 senior military and intelligence commanders were eliminated in those opening salvos. The goal was to simultaneously sever the head and just completely paralyze the central nervous system of the state.
Okay, I want to dig into the actual mechanics of how they achieved that, because you don't just, fly into heavily fortified hostile airspace and drop a bomb on the capital without a massive precursor operation.
No, it requires a staggering amount of prep.
And the ACLE telemetry data is just wild. The U.S. and Israel prioritized the complete blinding of the country's early warning systems. They eliminated roughly 200 Iranian air defense systems right out of the gate.
Yeah, 200 nodes.
That's a massive number.
It really is. And this is where the technological mismatch becomes glaringly apparent. To take out 200 integrated defense systems, you are employing a highly sophisticated suppression of enemy air defenses, or SEAD campaign.
How does that actually work in practice?
Well, it involves intense electronic warfare. So they're jamming the radar frequencies, so the Iranian operators are essentially just staring at static.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and that's followed immediately by anti-radiation missiles. These are missiles that actually ride the radar beams straight back to the emitting dishes and destroy them.
That is terrifyingly precise.
It is. By blinding those nodes, the ACLA analysis notes that the coalition established virtually uncontested control of the airspace, from the western borders all the way deep into central Tehran within a 24-hour window.
Which basically clears the corridor for the heavy assets, because the reports detail the deployment of U.S. B-1 and B-2 strategic bombers.
Right. And to be clear, you don't use a B-2 stealth bomber to hit a surface-level radar dish.
Yeah, that would be overkill.
Massive overkill. You use those platforms to carry massive, specialized payloads designed to literally crack the Earth open.
They were specifically targeting the subterranean ballistic missile infrastructure, right?
Exactly. The deeply buried, hardened facilities that Iran has spent decades boring into the sides of mountains to protect their strategic deterrent.
And the scope of this initial blinding and dismantling phase, it extended way beyond the mainland. Power projection relies heavily on naval presence, and the coalition systematically targeted Iran's blue water capabilities.
Yeah, the data confirms the destruction of 17 Iranian warships.
17. In one go.
And there was a particularly devastating incident detailed by the crisis group. A U.S. submarine tracked and sank an Iranian frigate all the way off the coast of Sri Lanka.
Wait, Sri Lanka? That is nowhere near the Gulf.
I know, but it resulted in the deaths of at least 80 sailors. The message there was clear. There is no safe harbor. Not in the mountains of Tehran, and not in the middle of the Indian Ocean.
Okay, let's unpack this. I follow the logic of hitting the radar, hitting the missile silos, and obviously the targeted assassination of the leadership. That all fits the definition of degrading military capability.
Right, standard military doctrine.
But looking closely at the target lists ACLED published, there are some anomalies that I really struggle to align with a strictly military objective.
Like what?
Well, they bombed the National Broadcasting Agency. And even more confusingly, they conducted heavy strikes on detention facilities and internal security outposts in the Kurdish city of Mariwan, which reportedly triggered a massive jailbreak.
Right, the Mariwan incident.
Yeah. I mean, it's like kicking over a hornet's nest while simultaneously trying to crush the queen. If your goal is to hunt ballistic missiles and dismantle a nuclear program, why are you spending millions of dollars in ordnance to blow open a local jail in a peripheral mountain town? Isn't that just mission creep?
Well, it looks like mission creep if you are viewing it purely through the lens of counterproliferation.
Yeah, so what's the other lens?
What's fascinating here is if you analyze it through the doctrine of horizontal escalation, it makes perfect, ruthless sense.
How so?
The strategists planning epic fury understood that Iran is a vast, ethnically and politically complex nation. The central government in Tehran relies heavily on internal security forces, like the Basij and the local police, to maintain a tight grip on restive peripheral populations.
Like the Kurdish minority in the West.
Exactly. So by hitting those specific internal security nodes, they are intentionally engineering domestic chaos.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it is the doctrine of peripheral destabilization. If you blow up a detention center in Mariwan and trigger a jailbreak, the local Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps commanders suddenly have a two-front problem.
They have to look up and look down at the same time.
Exactly. They were trying to look up at the sky to fight off B-2 bombers, but they also have to deploy troops into the streets to suppress an immediate domestic uprising or recapture prisoners.
You are intentionally stretching a highly centralized security apparatus to its absolute breaking point.
Right at the exact moment you have killed the man at the top who coordinates that apparatus. The goal is to make the system turn inward on itself.
But does that actually work? I mean, history usually tells us that when a country is subjected to massive foreign bombardment, the population, even a population that deeply resents its own government, tends to rally around the flag.
It's a very common historical pattern, yes.
Right. People usually prioritize surviving the foreign bombs over overthrowing the local police chief.
And that is the massive gamble inherent in this strategy, which the analysts at the crisis group point out. Betting on internal fragmentation as a force multiplier for an aerial campaign is incredibly risky.
Yeah, it seems like a huge stretch.
It is. But in those crucial first days, the goal wasn't necessarily to foster a successful democratic revolution. It was simply to generate enough friction and confusion in the provinces to prevent the regime from mounting a coordinated, unified defense of its strategic assets.
Wow. But here is the terrifying reality of a decentralized, heavily militarized state. A decapitated regime is not a defeated regime.
Absolutely not.
You killed the supreme leader. You wiped out the radar, and you sparked riots in the provinces. But underneath all of that, the physical architecture of Iran's retaliatory capability, the mobile launchers, the drone swarms, it was already built, fueled, and distributed.
Just waiting for the order.
Yeah, and the remnants of that military apparatus, they didn't hesitate. They unleashed a predetermined massive counterattack that instantly turned this from a bilateral strike into a sprawling regional war.
The speed of the retaliation is really what redefined the conflict.
It was almost instant.
It was. For months prior to February 28, Iranian military officials had explicitly telegraphed their doctrine. They warned that any direct assault on their soil, regardless of whether it was unilaterally Israeli or jointly U.S.-led, would result in immediate catastrophic consequences for every single U.S. security partner in the hemisphere.
They promised a 360-degree retaliation.
And the data shows they executed exactly that.
The geographic scope of the retaliation is just staggering. They didn't just fire back at Tel Aviv.
No, they went everywhere.
They spun the compass and launched munitions at U.S. bases and allied interests in Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iraq, Jordan, Turkey.
Even Cyprus.
Right. They even managed to target a British military installation in Cyprus. It's just an indiscriminate blanketing of the map.
Well, it is the brutal logic of asymmetric warfare. Iran has known for 30 years that its conventional air force and air defenses cannot survive a head-to-head confrontation with American and Israeli technology.
It's not even a contest.
Right. So their entire defense doctrine has been built around deterrence through unacceptable punishment. With the skies over Tehran compromised and their leadership gone, the hardliners who immediately seized control of the Transitional Council, these are figures heavily tied to the IRGC, and influenced by hardliners like Ali Larijani, they calculated that restraint was a death sentence.
So they just went all in.
Their only viable tactical option was to maximize the physical and economic pain for Washington's allies as quickly as humanly possible. They were hoping the sheer shock would force an international demand for a ceasefire.
Let's look at the actual telemetry and strike numbers, because the ACLED and crisis group data really illustrates the scale of this swarm.
The numbers are wild.
By March 5th, which is barely a week into the conflict, Iran had launched 2,034 ballistic missiles and suicide drones, specifically targeting the Gulf states alone.
And a huge chunk of those went to the UAE.
Over 12,270 aimed directly at the UAE. They struck the physical compounds of the U.S. embassies in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait City. And against Israel, despite the intense bombing of Iranian launch sites, ACLED recorded over 90 major attempted strikes in the first 5 days alone.
And we really have to emphasize the qualitative difference of these strikes compared to previous, more performative escalations.
Like when they used to warn people.
Exactly. In the past, we've seen missiles deliberately aimed at empty patches of desert or early warning alerts given just to minimize casualties. This was the exact opposite.
This was meant to kill.
This was a maximum yield attempt to cause mass casualties. And while Israel's multi-layered defense systems intercepted the vast majority, the mathematics of a swarm dictate that some will always get through.
Yeah, you can't catch them all.
Roughly 20 strikes directly penetrated densely populated civilian areas in central Israel, including direct hits in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. There was one particularly horrific impact in the town of Bet Shemesh that killed 9 civilians instantly.
Which brings us to what I find to be the most fascinating and frankly terrifying dynamic of modern aerial warfare. The ACLN analysts frame this entire war as a brutal, high-stakes math problem.
It's a math problem, yeah. It's an attrition matrix.
On one side, you have Iran's offensive stockpile. Before February 28, intelligence estimates suggested they possessed roughly 2,500 long-range ballistic missiles alongside tens of thousands of cheaper drones.
Right, and that inventory is bleeding out rapidly because they are firing them constantly, and the U.S. is simultaneously bombing the factories and depots that produce them.
Right. But the other side of the ledger is what keeps military planners in Washington and Tel Aviv awake at night. Israel and the United States are burning through their defensive stockpiles. The Patriot missiles, the Arrow 3 interceptors, the David Sling systems.
And here is where the mechanical reality of the war sets in. You can conceptualize this like a cybernetic immune system.
Okay, I like that analogy.
The interceptors are the white blood cells. They are incredibly sophisticated, highly effective at eliminating the threat, but they are finite. They take months, sometimes years to manufacture, and they cost millions of dollars apiece.
Imagine a billionaire and a millionaire in a standoff, right? One is throwing relatively cheap rocks in massive swarms, and the other is forced to use million-dollar glass shields to block every single one. Who runs out of resources first?
That's the perfect way to look at it. It's a completely inverted cost-exchange ratio. You are forced to fire a $3 million interceptor to destroy a $30,000 drone.
Because if you don't, that drone hits a power plant.
Or a high-rise apartment, exactly. So the ultimate question of this war isn't who has the better technology. It's a grim calculation of who runs out of resources first. Does Iran run out of launchers before the U.S. and its Gulf allies run out of interceptors?
Which is terrifying. And if the interceptor stockpiles reach critical depletion before the Iranian launch capability is entirely degraded from the air, the protective dome over the Middle East simply collapses.
And the transitional IRGC leadership understands this math perfectly.
They know exactly what they're doing.
Their ideology is rooted in a culture of resistance and martyrdom. They are demonstrating a profound willingness to absorb immense infrastructural pain in Tehran if it means they can inflict unsustainable systemic pain on the region. They believe their ultimate strategic weapon is their endurance.
Which makes the situation for the countries caught in the geographic crossfire an absolute nightmare. The Iranian strategy of blanketing the region brings us directly to the collapse of the security paradigm in the Gulf Arab states.
The situation for the Gulf Cooperation Council states Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Oman. It's perhaps the most striking strategic failure of the last decade.
How so?
Well, for years leading up to 2026, these nations engaged in intense, deliberate hedging. They looked at the rising tensions between the U.S., Israel, and Iran, and they decided their best survival mechanism was diplomacy.
They wanted to play both sides, basically.
Yeah, they aggressively pursued détente with Tehran. They reopened embassies, engaged in high-level economic summits, and publicly distanced themselves from anti-Iran rhetoric.
They went out of their way to explicitly state, on the public record, that they would absolutely not allow their sovereign airspace or the U.S. military bases located on their territory to be utilized for offensive strikes against Iran.
Right. They tried to build an impenetrable diplomatic firewall around their economies.
But they operated under the assumption that this diplomatic goodwill, combined with the implicit deterrence of hosting U.S. forces, would insulate them. They believed they could compartmentalize regional security.
But that hedging strategy evaporated the moment the first bunker buster hit Tehran. Iran ignored the diplomatic firewall entirely and pulled the Gulf states into the war on day one.
And they didn't just hit military installations out in the desert either.
No, they went for the jugular.
The ACLED data points out that the strikes deliberately targeted the psychological and economic centers of gravity in the Gulf. They hit civilian infrastructure, they struck international airports, they targeted emblematic luxury commercial districts in the UAE.
Places built entirely on the premise of safety and stability for foreign investors.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They struck Kuwaiti oil infrastructure, creating such chaotic airspace that 3 U.S. F-15 fighter jets were actually downed over Kuwait in friendly fire incidents.
Which is just a tragic level of chaos.
And most shockingly, they launched strikes into Oman and Qatar.
And striking Oman and Qatar is a deeply symbolic and aggressive maneuver.
These are usually the neutral ones, right?
Historically, Muscat and Doha have served as the vital, neutral intermediaries for indirect negotiations between Washington and Tehran. So by targeting the mediators, Iran sent an unequivocal message: the era of back-channel diplomacy is over.
Wow.
They view the entire U.S.-aligned security architecture, regardless of the individual host nation's diplomatic posture, as a monolithic, legitimate target.
But didn't this massive escalation essentially force the Gulf states to do exactly what Iran feared?
What do you mean?
Well, the Cambridge-MENA Forum piece provides an incredible look at how this barrage fundamentally stress-tested the Abraham Accords. Under the umbrella of U.S. Central Command, a massive real-time regional air defense plan was activated.
Yes, the CETCOM network.
And you had nations that do not even have formal diplomatic relations with Israel, like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, actively coordinating with CETCOM. They were sharing radar telemetry and actually intercepting Iranian drones that were transiting their airspace en route to Israeli targets.
The operational coordination detailed in those leaked CNTCOM assessments is truly unprecedented. For years, the Gulf states publicly condemned Israeli actions in places like Gaza, maintaining a strict political distance.
But push came to shove.
Exactly. When the sky filled with Iranian loitering munitions, the immediate imperative of state survival instantly overrode historical political grievances. You saw the emergence of a de facto heavily integrated multilateral air defense network operating at lightning speed, connecting radar arrays from the Persian Gulf straight through to the Mediterranean.
So I have to ask the obvious question here. If Saudi and Qatari anti-air batteries are shooting down drones, specifically to protect Israeli airspace and U.S. bases, does this mean they are now firmly in an anti-Iran military alliance, or are they just in survival mode?
It is entirely survival mode. It would be a catastrophic miscalculation for analysts in Washington or Tel Aviv to view this kinetic cooperation as enthusiastic alliance building.
Because they didn't want this fight.
Exactly. As Chatham House thoroughly documents, the Gulf monarchs are terrified. They feel like they've been conscripted as geographic human shields for a preemptive U.S. Israeli war that lacks a defined endgame. The core thesis of the modern Gulf economy, what analysts call the security illusion, is dead.
Okay, unpack that term for me. Explain the security illusion.
It was the belief that a nation like the UAE could build a glitzy, hyper-modern, globally connected financial and tourism hub while living next door to a heavily armed revisionist state like Iran simply by balancing relationships.
Ah, I see.
But you cannot be a safe haven for global capital if foreign investors are suddenly forced to pay exorbitant war risk insurance premiums just to dock a ship at your port, or if your international airports are shutting down daily due to falling interceptor shrapnel.
That makes perfect sense.
The illusion that wealth can insulate you from hard-power geography has been shattered entirely.
But while the Gulf states are relying on high-tech interceptors and billion-dollar radar networks to survive the swarm from above, Iran's traditional proxy network, the notorious Ring of Fire, is facing a completely different, much more brutal reality down on the ground.
Oh, the proxy dynamic has shifted dramatically.
We have to look at how this war is functionally dismantling the axis of resistance, starting with Lebanon and Hezbollah.
For 2 decades, the core of Iran's forward defense strategy was the axis of resistance. The theory was sound on paper. If Israel or the U.S. ever launched a direct strike on Iranian soil, this massive network of heavily armed non-state actors in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen would immediately activate, overwhelming the coalition from every conceivable border.
And Hezbollah was the crown jewel of this network, right? Possessing an arsenal of over 100,000 rockets aimed at northern Israel.
Right.
But the timeline in the sources shows a massive failure of that theory. Hezbollah did not activate on February 28. They sat entirely dormant for over 48 hours while Tehran burned.
Complete radio silence.
They didn't officially launch their retaliatory strikes until March 2nd, framing it specifically as a response to the assassination of Ayatollah Khamenei. Why the hesitation from Iran's most lethal proxy?
The hesitation reveals the reality of Hezbollah's physical degradation prior to this war. As both ACLED and the crisis group note, you have to factor in the compounding damage Hezbollah suffered during the extended Gaza conflict from 2023 through 2025.
Oh, right. They were already bleeding.
Israel had spent years systematically hunting their senior commanders, degrading their supply lines through Syria, and executing highly sophisticated psychological operations.
Like the exploding pagers incident.
Exactly. Hezbollah was operating under a very fragile ceasefire, internally exhausted and politically vulnerable within Lebanon. They really did not want this war. They entered it not from a position of strategic advantage, but out of a grim ideological obligation to their patrons in Tehran.
And the Israeli response to Hezbollah's entry on March 2nd wasn't just a proportional exchange of fire. It was absolute apocalyptic destruction.
Israel saw an opening.
Knowing Hezbollah was weak, Israel seized the opportunity to fundamentally alter the northern border. They launched over 250 heavy airstrikes across Lebanon in a matter of hours.
Just a massive barrage.
They systematically flattened infrastructure in southern Lebanon, the Bekaa Valley, and the densely populated Dahi suburbs of southern Beirut. They issued mass evacuation orders that displaced hundreds of thousands of civilians almost overnight.
And they followed the bombardment with a heavy, mechanized ground invasion into southern Lebanon.
Explicitly aiming to push Hezbollah forces completely north of the Litani River and establish a permanent physical security buffer.
And the sheer scale of Israel's response forced the hand of the Lebanese central government, which led to an unprecedented internal political collapse for Hezbollah.
Because Lebanon as a state was already suffering from one of the worst economic depressions in modern history.
Right. So, facing total destruction from an Israeli invasion, the Lebanese cabinet took an extraordinary measure on March 2nd. They officially designated Hezbollah's military wing as an illegal entity. They outlawed their activities entirely and issued formal orders to the Lebanese armed forces to disarm the group by all means necessary.
I just want to highlight the sheer absurdity and terror of that position for a Hezbollah fighter on the ground. You are sitting in a trench in southern Lebanon. In front of you is a highly advanced Israeli armored division actively invading your territory, backed by total air supremacy.
A literal nightmare scenario.
And behind you, your own national government, a government that historically included your own political allies, has just declared you an outlaw militia and ordered the national army to shoot you if you don't surrender your weapons.
You are completely physically crushed from the outside and entirely politically isolated from the inside.
If you're Hezbollah, what do you even do? Is the axis of resistance dead or just dormant?
Well, that isolation is precisely the strategic objective. The Cambridge MENA Forum analysis explicitly points out that Israel recognized the decapitation of Iran as a once-in-a-generation window of opportunity.
To finish the job.
Exactly. With Tehran consumed by its own succession crisis and physically unable to resupply its proxies, Israel shifted its doctrine from merely deterring Hezbollah to permanently eliminating them as a viable military threat.
They want to turn Iran's network into a mere narrative.
Yes, to degrade the axis of resistance from a physical, heavily armed network into nothing more than history.
Which provides incredible context for the behavior of the Houthi rebels down in Yemen. When you look at Hezbollah getting ground into dust, the Houthis' sudden silence makes a lot of sense.
It really does.
Because throughout previous conflicts, the Houthis were the most volatile wildcards, firing ballistic missiles at Eilat, shutting down global shipping in the Red Sea. But since February 28, despite massive protests in the streets of Sazan and incredibly fiery rhetoric condemning the strikes on Iran, they have fundamentally stayed out of the kinetic fight.
They've been very quiet militarily.
They haven't resumed the Red Sea blockade. They haven't launched major swarms at Israel. Why the restraint?
It is a masterclass in ruthless self-preservation, which analysts politely refer to as strategic patience.
Strategic patience.
Right. The Houthis are fanatical, but they are not suicidal. As the ACLED report details, the Houthis suffered their own severe, decapitating Israeli airstrikes in late 2025.
So they know exactly what it feels like.
They have visceral, recent memories of what a concentrated Israeli air campaign looks like. They also recognize the geopolitical reality. Their primary benefactor, the IRGC, is fighting an existential war for its own life.
So if the Iranian state collapses, the weapons smuggling pipeline to Yemen dries up entirely.
Exactly. The Houthis rely on Iranian technology and funding to maintain their grip on power in Yemen against domestic rivals. If they enter a direct war with Israel and the U.S. now, they won't save Tehran, but they will absolutely invite a retaliatory bombing campaign that could destroy their own military infrastructure and break their control over Sana'a.
They are choosing to husband their resources and let their patron burn rather than throw themselves onto the pyre. That leaves Iraq as the final, most tragic piece of this proxy puzzle. Because Iraq is essentially being used as a free fire zone by everyone.
It's a complete mess in Iraq.
You have the heavily armed, Iran-backed, popular mobilization force militias groups like Kataib Hezbollah operating entirely outside the control of the Iraqi prime minister in Baghdad. These militias are fulfilling their access obligations by launching drone strikes against U.S. positions, like the Harir base in Erbil.
And the U.S. and Israeli response is immediate kinetic strikes on militia weapons depots and command centers located deep inside Iraqi sovereign territory.
Right.
But it doesn't stop there. Because Iran is terrified that the U.S. might use Iranian Kurdish opposition groups operating in northern Iraq to funnel weapons and stoke the internal uprisings we discussed earlier.
So what does Iran do?
Tehran is simultaneously launching its own ballistic missiles into the Iraqi Kurdistan region to wipe out those groups.
So if you are the government in Baghdad, your country is being bombed simultaneously by the United States, Israel, and Iran, while rogue militias run rampant in your cities. Sovereignty is just a word on a piece of paper at that point.
Completely meaningless.
When you look at Lebanon, Yemen, and Iraq comprehensively, the Iranian strategy of forward defense has functionally collapsed. The ring of fire has been neutralized or deterred.
The network is severely fragmented and entirely focused on localized survival. It is no longer the cohesive, multi-front existential threat to Israel that it was designed to be.
It's a massive shift.
It is. But the coalition cannot celebrate this tactical victory without acknowledging the devastating secondary effects. You cannot dismantle deep-rooted geopolitical networks with high-yield explosives without simultaneously dismantling the global supply chains that physically run through that same geography.
Which transitions us perfectly into the economic mechanics of this war. Because the conflict isn't just taking place in the airspace and the trenches. It is tearing apart the trading floors and the shipping lanes.
The economic fallout is staggering.
The most critical artery of the global economy, the Strait of Hormuz, is experiencing total paralysis. This is a 21-mile-wide choke point connecting the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. And Iran, facing the prospect of total regime collapse, has moved to strangle it.
And the tactical shift here is crucial to understand. Iran doesn't need a massive, sophisticated blue water navy to close the strait.
What are they using instead?
As the Chatham House report details, they are utilizing asymmetric denial of service tactics. They have mobilized fast attack craft, deployed sea mines, and most effectively utilized coastal anti-ship ballistic missiles to target commercial vessels attempting the transit.
And they actually fired some, right?
They demonstrated their intent by firing missiles in the direction of the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group. While the munitions fell short, the kinetic message was received loud and clear by every shipping conglomerate on Earth. These waters are unsurvivable.
And the mechanism that actually enforces the blockade isn't even the Iranian military. It's the marine insurance market in London. An actuary sitting at a desk looking at the risk of a supertanker getting hit by a drone simply raises the war risk premium to a level that completely wipes out any profit margin for the shipping company. The traffic just stops.
The math doesn't work anymore.
The situation is so deeply compromised that the French government dispatched a nuclear-fueled aircraft carrier to the Mediterranean and is frantically attempting to piece together an international naval coalition simply to physically escort civilian tankers through the corridor.
And the Gulf states are panicking because their economies are entirely dependent on exporting hydrocarbons out of that specific waterway. They are scrambling to implement physical workarounds.
How do you work around a strait?
Well, the Chatham House data shows Saudi Arabia has maxed out the capacity of its east-west pipeline, pumping roughly 5 million barrels of crude oil a day directly to the port of Yanbu on the Red Sea, completely bypassing Hormuz.
And the UAE is doing something similar.
Yeah, the UAE is executing a similar maneuver, routing about 1.5 million barrels via pipeline to the port of Fujairah on the Arabian Sea.
Okay, I mean, that sounds like a massive amount of oil successfully bypassing the conflict zone.
It is a significant volume, but it fundamentally misunderstands the physics of global energy consumption. Even running at maximum pressure, those alternative pipelines can only transport roughly 1/4 of the total daily volume that traditionally flows through the strait on supertankers.
Oh, wow. Just a quarter.
You cannot replace a 20-mile-wide ocean strait with a steel pipe. The global energy market is suddenly starved of millions of barrels of oil per day, sending shockwaves through global pricing, and simultaneously, the Gulf states are bleeding billions in lost revenue.
We even saw Qatar forcefully halt operations at its primary liquefied natural gas export facility, didn't we?
Yes, while Saudi Arabia suspended loadings at its largest eastern oil terminal.
And the contagion effect of that energy shock spreads immediately across the broader Middle East and North Africa. Look at the data coming out of Turkey. Both the Global Times and the Crisis Group emphasize how deeply alarmed the government in Ankara is.
They are very, very worried.
They are not merely concerned about a shift in the regional balance of power. They are facing a direct threat to their domestic economic survival.
Because Turkey was already managing a highly precarious economy, battling persistent inflation rates hovering around 30%, a massive portion of their natural gas is imported directly from Iran.
Right. So if that stops?
If those pipelines are severed by the conflict, or if the broader restriction of Gulf oil spikes global energy prices, Turkey's fragile economic recovery is instantly derailed.
And that's just the economic side.
Right. Furthermore, If the U.S. strategy of peripheral destabilization actually succeeds and the Iranian state fractures, Turkey is bracing for an overwhelming influx of millions of refugees across its eastern border.
Which they can't handle.
And politically, they are terrified that a power vacuum in Iran will embolden Kurdish separatist groups like PJA. Ankara fears these groups might receive quiet backing from Israel or the U.S. to further harass Iranian forces, but who will inevitably utilize that strength to destabilize Turkey.
The interconnectedness is just brutal. And the situation in Egypt is even more catastrophic. Egypt's economy was essentially on life support before February 28.
Oh, Egypt is in a very dark place.
And the mechanics of this war hit them from 3 different directions simultaneously. Within the first 24 hours of the conflict, citing immediate security risks to the offshore platforms, Israel unilaterally suspended all natural gas exports from the Leviathan field to Egypt.
Cut off instantly.
In that same window, the Qatari LNG shipments that Egypt relies on were halted because the tankers couldn't safely exit the Gulf. Egypt was suddenly plunged into a massive immediate energy deficit.
And as we know, international capital is inherently cowardly. It flees at the first sign of systemic risk.
Yeah, investors don't stick around for wars.
Exactly. The Chatham House analysis highlights a devastating phenomenon. Foreign investors looking at the energy crisis and the potential for broader regional war immediately dumped Egyptian sovereign debt.
Wow.
An estimated $1.4 billion in capital fled the country almost overnight. The Egyptian pound went into freefall against the dollar.
And what about the Suez Canal?
Well, the Suez Canal is one of the very few reliable sources of hard foreign currency for the government in Cairo, but it saw its transit revenue evaporate as global shipping firms rerouted vessels around the Cape of Good Hope to avoid the entire region.
It's the ultimate geopolitical domino effect. A precision bunker buster bomb drops on a command center in Tehran, and the mechanical consequence is that within a week, a textile factory in Egypt has to shut down because the natural gas grid failed.
And a container ship full of consumer electronics is stranded at a dock in Dubai because the insurance premium tripled.
And the average citizen in Istanbul watches their currency lose purchasing power in real time.
You cannot surgically extract the military architecture of a region without simultaneously severing the vital economic arteries that allow these societies to function.
And we cannot discuss severed arteries without confronting the staggering, horrifying human toll of this machinery. We have to ground all of this abstract military doctrine and economic theory in the physical reality of what this violence is doing to the people trapped underneath it.
The reports compiled by the World Health Organization provide a deeply sobering, highly quantified assessment of the immediate humanitarian catastrophe.
The numbers are grim.
Very grim. The casualty figures escalated with terrifying speed. Within the first 10 days of the air campaign, Iranian health authorities were recording over 1,300 civilian deaths.
We have to pause and look closely at one specific, horrific incident documented by both the WHO and ACLE, because it strips away the sanitized language of precision strikes.
The Manab strike.
Yes. A coalition munition targeted an IRGC command complex located in the southern Iranian city of Manab. But the complex was situated directly adjacent to a primary school.
Right.
The blast radius and secondary explosions completely destroyed the school. At least 150 children were killed instantly. It demonstrates the gruesome, unavoidable reality of utilizing high-yield, deep-penetrating munitions in populated urban environments. The collateral damage is inherently catastrophic, regardless of the technological sophistication of the bomb.
It is a devastating tragedy, and the suffering is not contained to Iran. In Lebanon, as the Israeli air and ground campaign expanded to crush Hezbollah, the WHO reported at least 570 immediate fatalities and over 1,400 severe injuries.
And the hospitals can't even handle it.
No, the crisis extends far beyond the direct kinetic impacts. The healthcare infrastructure itself is collapsing under the systematic bombardment. The WHO verified 25 direct strikes on healthcare facilities in Lebanon and 18 in Iran, which resulted in the deaths of 8 essential health workers.
So they're hitting the people trying to save lives.
In Lebanon, the scale of the displacement and the intensity of the bombing forced 49 primary healthcare centers and 5 major hospitals to shut down entirely and evacuate.
So at the exact moment the civilian population is experiencing mass trauma and requires emergency medical intervention, the hospitals are either craters in the ground or abandoned. And this drives a secondary crisis of mass displacement. The numbers are almost impossible to conceptualize. 700,000 people displaced internally in Lebanon, fleeing the armored incursions in the south and the airstrikes in the Bekaa Valley, desperately cramming into overwhelmed collective shelters in the north.
Another 100,000 civilians displaced internally within Iran.
And the WHO report highlights a deeply concerning long-term environmental hazard emerging directly from the coalition's targeting strategy in Iran.
Right, yes, the fires. By systematically destroying energy infrastructure, oil refineries, and storage depots, they have ignited massive, uncontrollable petroleum fires.
Which are just burning nonstop.
These infernos are generating incredibly thick plumes of toxic smoke that are blanketing surrounding communities. The populations are being exposed to high concentrations of carcinogenic pollutants.
So it's an immediate air quality crisis.
But it's not just an inhalation hazard. The particulate matter is settling, contaminating the groundwater supplies and poisoning the agricultural soil. We are looking at an ecological and public health disaster that will cause elevated mortality rates for decades after the bombing stops.
And this brings us back to the strategic intent behind the suffering. As we discussed earlier, the U.S. and Israeli strikes deliberately targeted internal security forces like the besieged police.
Right, aiming to fracture the regime.
There's a clear implicit hope among certain policy architects in Washington and Tel Aviv that the sheer, unrelenting pressure of the bombing, the collapse of the economy, and the loss of essential services, combined with the death of the supreme leader, will finally spark the massive civilian uprising necessary to overthrow the Islamic Republic from within.
It's the application of maximum external pressure to trigger an internal fracture. But as you noted earlier, this raises profound historical and psychological questions.
Right. I mean, if you are an average Iranian citizen, your city is on fire, your children's schools are being destroyed, and your water is poisoned by foreign aircraft. Even if you despise the theocracy governing you, human psychology dictates that you prioritize the immediate external threat to your survival.
Of course you do.
Is Washington suffering from a massive analytical blind spot by hoping a traumatized, bombarded civilian population will do the work of regime change for them?
The analysts at the International Crisis Group certainly believe so. They explicitly characterize this reliance on a spontaneous democratic uprising as its own form of strategic incoherence.
Strategic incoherence, that's a strong phrase.
It is. It is true that the Iranian public harbors profound, deeply rooted grievances against the state, as evidenced by the massive protest movements of the past few years. But the public is fundamentally unarmed. They are physically exhausted and terrified.
And IRGC is still there.
Exactly. Despite the decapitation of the supreme leadership, they are still facing the IRGC, a deeply entrenched, heavily armed, highly ideological security apparatus that now views the defense of the nation and the survival of its own power as entirely synonymous.
So bombing a neighborhood and expecting the survivors to dust themselves off and overthrow the local military garrison is a strategic fantasy.
It assumes a predictable, controllable outcome from manufactured chaos, which is a fallacy. If the central state does buckle under this pressure, you do not automatically get a compliant, stable, democratic Iran.
What do you get?
It is far more mathematically probable that you get a chaotic, multi-factional civil war spanning a vast territory right on the border of the Persian Gulf, complete with heavily armed proxy factions, loose ballistic missiles, and severely compromised nuclear facilities.
Wow. And that terrifying possibility forces us to examine the ultimate question driving this entire conflict. What exactly is the coalition's strategy? When the dust settles, what does winning actually look like?
That is the million-dollar question.
Because when you review the diplomatic and political statements documented by the Crisis Group, the justifications for this massive war seem to shift constantly.
The shifting rationales indicate a profound lack of consensus regarding the desired endgame. Early in the year, as tensions rose, the U.S. administration framed its military posture largely around a moral imperative to protect Iranian civilian protesters from state violence.
But then it changed.
As the carrier strike groups arrived, the messaging pivoted sharply to a counter-proliferation argument, claiming the strikes were strictly necessary to unilaterally dismantle the Iranian nuclear program.
And then we witnessed a press conference that completely defied strategic logic. The U.S. Secretary of State publicly claimed that the United States had to launch these massive strikes against Iran because intelligence indicated Israel was planning to strike Iran, and the U.S. knew Iran would inevitably respond by attacking U.S. bases in the region. So, stripped of the diplomatic jargon, the United States preemptively bombed a sovereign nation to defend itself against a hypothetical retaliation for an Israeli strike that hadn't even occurred yet.
It is a dizzying, entirely circular logic of self-defense that essentially guarantees continuous escalation, and it completely obscures the actual political objectives.
What are they actually trying to achieve?
Are they merely attempting to degrade offensive capabilities to restore a favorable deterrence balance? Are they attempting to force Iran back to the negotiating table for a highly restrictive nuclear treaty? Or is the unspoken, overriding objective total, irreversible regime change?
Well, President Trump stripped away the ambiguity on social media. He posted a direct mandate stating that there will be absolutely no negotiations and no deals without Iran's unconditional surrender, and he explicitly demanded the installation of a new, great, and acceptable leader.
Which is a demand that practically guarantees a protracted existential war. Unconditional surrender is not a concept that exists within the ideological framework of the Islamic Republic, even a severely degraded one.
I don't know the meaning of the word.
Exactly. But if we want to understand what the mechanism of installing a great and acceptable leader actually looks like in practice, the Council on Foreign Relations provided a fascinating analysis of a parallel governance effort currently playing out in Gaza.
The Gaza parallel is incredibly revealing regarding the current U.S. blueprint for the Middle East. Following the intense phases of the conflict there, the U.S. unilaterally spearheaded the creation of a new international transitional authority, literally named the Board of Peace, chaired directly by President Trump.
Right, the Board of Peace.
And this board subsequently appointed a National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, which bypassed traditional political factions and was staffed almost entirely by U.S.-approved Palestinian technocrats.
They installed figures like Ali Shath, a civil engineer and former Palestinian Authority official, to manage the day-to-day operations of the territory. They established specific commissioners for health, the economy, and education.
So it's basically a government in a box.
Exactly. It is essentially a prepackaged government in a box, operating entirely under the supervision and mandate of the U.S.-led Board of Peace.
And the CFR piece makes a crucial point. The charter for this Board of Peace was written with deliberate ambiguity. Trump envisions utilizing this exact same mechanism in other global conflict zones.
It's a template.
Right. So when you connect the dots, you see a sweeping, almost imperial assertion of American hard power. The vision is to unilaterally dictate the post-conflict governance structures of the entire region. They are selecting the specific technocrats who will run Gaza and simultaneously demanding the complete surrender of Iran so they can install a leader of their own choosing in Tehran.
It is an ambitious, high-risk attempt to forge an entirely new regional reality purely through overwhelming military force and executive mandate. But the United States does not have a monopoly on the diplomatic chessboard. And this is where we have to examine the counterplay from China, which is operating on a fundamentally different strategic frequency.
The editorial we pulled from China's Global Times paints a fascinating picture. While the United States is deploying B-2 stealth bombers and demanding unconditional surrender, the Chinese diplomatic corps is aggressively working the phones.
They are very busy.
In the first 2 weeks of the war, Beijing held high-level discussions with the foreign ministers of 12 different nations, including Russia, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Israel, and France. They immediately dispatched a special envoy directly to the conflict zone.
China is seizing the moment to heavily promote its global security initiative. This is a diplomatic framework founded on 5 core principles that stand in stark contrast to the U.S. approach.
What are the principles?
They emphasize absolute respect for national sovereignty, the rejection of the abuse of military force, strict non-interference in internal domestic affairs, the necessity of political settlements for hotspot issues, and the constructive role of major powers as mediators rather than combatants.
So it is the exact rhetorical and philosophical opposite of regime change and unconditional surrender.
Yeah.
How is the rest of the world reacting to these two completely diametric superpower visions?
China's maneuvering is incredibly shrewd. They accurately diagnose that the broader Middle East, and particularly the wealthy Gulf states, are exhausted by decades of kinetic conflict and deeply terrified by the unpredictability of U.S. military interventions.
Yeah, they just want to do business.
China is leveraging its soft power, pointing to its recent history of successful diplomatic mediation like brokering the historic 2023 rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran to present itself as the rational, stable, mercantile alternative to American militarism.
Offering a different path.
They are offering the region a vision of security predicated on economic integration and quiet diplomacy, contrasting it sharply with the U.S. strategy of reshaping borders with bunker busters.
And what about Europe? Where do the traditional Western allies stand when forced to choose between the American hammer and the Chinese olive branch?
The crisis group analysis paints a picture of a paralyzed Europe. A few individual nations have quietly questioned the legal basis of the preemptive U.S. Israeli strikes, but collectively the European leadership is acquiescing entirely to Washington's actions. And the underlying reason is pure, brutal, realpolitik. European capitals are terrified that if they actively oppose the United States on its Middle East policy, Washington will retaliate by cutting off critical military support for Ukraine and potentially rolling back its NATO security commitments on the European continent.
So they're just keeping their heads down.
They are consciously choosing to swallow their deep objections to the war in Iran to guarantee their own survival against the threat of Russia.
It all fundamentally loops back to the raw mechanics of survival. Let's take a breath and try to synthesize the sheer, staggering magnitude of the machinery we've just unpacked today.
It's a lot to process.
We started with the terrifying suddenness of February 28th, the U.S. and Israeli operations that utilized B-2 bombers and massive electronic warfare to blind Iran and immediately decapitate its leadership, killing Ayatollah Khamenei and sparking an unprecedented multi-front war.
We examine the mechanics of Iran's 360-degree retaliation, breaking down the mathematical nightmare of interceptor attrition as thousands of missiles and drones fundamentally shattered the security illusion of the Gulf Arab states,
dragging nations like the UAE and Saudi Arabia into a desperate, high-tech fight for survival.
We looked at the collapse of the proxy networks, how Israel utilized the window of Iranian paralysis to launch an apocalyptic air and ground invasion that physically and politically cornered Hezbollah in Lebanon,
while the Houthis in Yemen opted for cold, strategic patience, husbanding their resources rather than fighting a losing war.
We traced the devastating secondary economic mechanisms, detailing how a few anti-ship missiles triggered a marine insurance crisis that paralyzed the Strait of Hormuz, rendering multi-million-dollar pipeline workarounds insufficient,
sending catastrophic waves of capital flight and inflation crashing into vulnerable economies like Egypt and Turkey.
And we grounded all of this geopolitical maneuvering in the horrifying physical reality on the ground, the thousands of civilian casualties, the targeted destruction of essential healthcare infrastructure, and the toxic ecological disasters poisoning the water.
All while competing superpowers fight over whether the future of the region will be dictated by forced technocratic mandates or mercantile diplomacy.
Which leaves us with a critical, profound question to consider as this crisis continues to escalate.
What's that?
We've discussed in granular detail how this massive war was launched with the implicit objective of entirely dismantling the old hostile security architecture of the Middle East. But if you violently destroy the old order through overwhelming military dominance without securing a viable, universally agreed-upon blueprint for the new one, and if your only tools for building the future are executive mandates and conditional alliances forged in a panic, are you actually constructing a lasting peace?
Oh.
Or are you simply setting the timer for an even larger, more catastrophic systemic explosion a decade from now?
That is the mechanical flaw in the strategy that haunts this entire crisis.
Yeah.
The horizon isn't just gone, it's been replaced by a shockwave, and no one knows where it stops.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us on this intense, difficult exploration of a world-altering event. We encourage you to keep looking past the headlines, keep questioning the mechanics of the weapons and the policies, and keep seeking to understand the deep structural currents driving this historic crisis as it continues to unfold.